Welcome to the Brigham Young University Family History Library webinar series. My name is Sean Firmage. I will be your host for this webinar. Before we start, feel free to participate in our polls down at the bottom of your screen. And if you have any questions during the presentation, please ask them. We will have a question pod to the right of the slideshow. As a reminder, our next webinar is tomorrow, Wednesday, June 14th at 3 p.m. Mountain Standard Time. And it will be titled Adoption and Finding Birth Parents for Genealogists, also presented by James Tanner. Today we will be pleased to hear from James Tanner, who will be giving a presentation titled Beginning Scottish Research. James has a bachelor's in Spanish and a master's in linguistics from the University of Utah. He received his Juris Doctor degree in law from Arizona State University. He worked for 39 years as an Arizona trial attorney. He previously owned a retail computer business and an Apple Macintosh software company. James has over 35 years of experience in genealogical research and is a blogger for Genealogy Star and the blog Rejoice and Be Exceeding Glad. He served for 10 years as a missionary at the Mesa, Arizona Family Search Library and is currently serving at the BYU Family History Library. He is the co-author or author of over 25 books on genealogical research and has presented at expos and conferences around the U.S. and Canada. James has 7 children and 33 grandchildren. And we will go ahead and turn the time over to you, James.
Okay. Well, here we go. This is James Tanner. Thanks for tuning in and watching this webinar. We're coming to you from the campus of the Brigham Young University in Provo, Utah, and this is a series of webinars. When the webinars are completed, they are recorded and uploaded to the BYU Family History Library YouTube channel, and we'd encourage you to subscribe to the channel. Subscribing, you get notices of the videos, but it helps the BYU Family History Library get a little more visibility on YouTube when you have a lot of subscriptions. So we're going to talk about beginning Scottish research, and the question we're going to ask is, where are the documents? And so that's going to be the thrust of the discussion here today. We've got to the next slide. We have a lot of Scottish immigrants to America. That's they're one of the larger groups of people who have come to America, and so we have a substantial number of people in the country who are descendants of Scottish ancestors. It's the 5th largest group of immigrants, and they have over 5 million people who have come to America from Scotland during the years. And basically, we need to go back a little bit here and do a little bit of history, give you an idea of who it is we're talking about. Now, one of the things that's important for a genealogist is to put things in a historical context, but it's also important to understand the background history of the countries where your ancestors came from, even if it's the United States, of course, and any of the other countries of the world, because the records that you have are to some extent determined by that country's history. So if people say, I came from such a country and they had a bunch of wars and all the records were destroyed, well, that's usually a misimpression. That's something that's said by people who are, and I'm going to have to say, purely propagandizing the issue, because a lot of records over the years, of course, have been destroyed because of wars and because of natural disasters and other things. But primarily, we understand that the core of records that we have are really pretty good. And from Scotland, we have good records, and we'll talk about how the time depth of those records and how they come. So you'll understand where we can get some of these records and how far back we can theoretically go with any given line. Now, given if you were a person, for instance, if you're a foundling and your mother left you on the doorstep of a fire station or a church or something, and then you don't know who your parents are, then you've got a whole different problem. But a lot of us who are doing genealogy are able to trace some of our lines back, and many lines back quite a few years, but some of our lines go way back in time. And we can do this because of the existence of records. And that's why it's important to focus on what records are available. Okay, so first of all, we start anciently with the Celts who lived in Scotland and England and through the entire British Isles. And they date back into about 2500 BC to about 43 AD. Now, what we're learning from not only from historical sources, but also from DNA studies, is that the Celts were not a group of a homogenous group of people. They were not all related to each other. They came from different tribes, and they actually came from different parts of Europe. So when you start doing DNA studies and couple it with genealogy, you come up with a lot of really interesting results because of the fact that the time depth that the DNA people are looking at can go back this many thousands of years. And they may be showing your people came from the steppes of Russia rather than from England, but they made it across Europe and into England thousands of years ago. So this is England and Scotland thousands of years ago. So the Celts were primarily the people who lived here, and that's, as I mentioned, a blanket term for the people until about 43 AD. And what happened in 43 AD was the Romans. The Romans had already begun many hundreds of years earlier to expand their empire. And by 43 AD, they were into what they called Britannia, Great Britain, the islands, and they began the process of trying to conquer the islands and expand their influence across the entire British Isles. So from 43 AD, we can see that, and by this way, this is a Roman coin from around the time when the Romans began to get into um, the British Isles. So at 122 AD, what happened is that the Romans got far enough north in Great Britain, through what we now call England, and they ran into the Celts, and who they called barbarians, of course, and I'm sure the Celts thought that Romans were pretty barbaric. But they came to kind of a standstill. They were unable to progress to push the empire any further. They were sort of running out of steam as far as the Roman Empire was concerned. And because the Celts were sort of a disorganized group of tribes, and if you think of it in terms of the United States, you would think of them in terms of Native American, the Indians, and the Indian Wars. In this case, the Celts won the war in a sense because the Romans gave up and built a wall across the entire country from coast to coast in an effort to stop the Celts from raiding down into the southern part. And they set up a series of forts all the way across the country called Hadrian's Wall. Now, all of these things have a bearing on your future genealogy because they have a bearing on the records that survive. They also have a bearing on the languages that the people ended up speaking. So in this case, it started at the River Tyne and near the North Sea and went all the way to Solway Firth on the Irish Sea. And this ended up being the northern limit of the Roman Empire. Now, shortly after that, they began the process in 142 AD to build a second wall. They tried to move further north and build a wall across the part which is now called Scotland, and they called it Antonine Wall. And the Antonine Wall was not necessarily like the Hadrian's Wall, which looked like a wall. It was more like a ditch with embankments, and they built that across. Unfortunately, that didn't work very well, and so that was kind of a fallback position. Here's a map showing where the Romans got to in beginning in 122 when they built Hadrian's Wall, and then a couple of years later when they tried to push it up to a narrower part and keep all of that section that we now call Scotland into at the northern portion. Now, the interesting thing is that these boundaries between the Romans and the Celts, or the tribes that were living in the north part of the British Isles, uh, have basically follow the same boundaries we have today between Scotland and England. So we still have a boundary between what they call Scotland and what they call England. So that's where that came from. Okay, so now we'll move forward. So basically, because the Roman Empire collapsed at some point, then they withdrew their troops and all of their people from England, from the British Isles, and from all of that area. And there was sort of a power vacuum created where other tribes and people tried to come in. So the date for the official date for the abandonment of Great Britain by Rome is 410 AD. Now, if we're looking at these dates from a purely historical genealogical standpoint, we have to realize that we don't have any written records that go back this far. Not that would help us with determining who our ancestors were in Scotland or in any other part of the British Isles. This is basically background to give you an idea of how how this country came to be, who makes it up, where it came from, and how these people became separated off. And so then what happened with the withdrawal of the Romans is there were almost constant battles going on. And those went from the 5th century up through the 8th century. That's 400s up to the 700 AD. And for that period of about 300 or 400 years in there, nobody did much of anything except fight. There was no, there's just a long oral history of battles that occurred during that period of time. And at the same time, we recognize that those of us who get some DNA testing done and for our English ancestry may find out we have some Scandinavian ancestors, and those Scandinavian ancestors were the Vikings who came in and in the 8th and 9th century and took over substantial portions of the British Isles at least on the west coast, mostly on the west coast of Scotland and England. But they did raid all the way down. By the way, the Vikings raided clear down into Spain and clear down around into the Mediterranean on occasion. So they were when they got on the ocean, they just kept going till they ran out of steam at some point or ran out of people to plunder. All of this fighting continued until the 12th century. And so Scotland is kind of a place sort of like Ireland in a sense, unlike England. Because in England, if you remember the English history a little bit, a man by the name of William the Conqueror, who set himself up as king, came across the Channel from France, from Normandy, and conquered all of England and managed to take the entire country. And at that point, from that point on, England was under the rule of a succession of kings who were the descendants of or the heirs of William the Conqueror and all of the people who he was associated with. That's kind of a really simplistic way of putting it, but that's basically what happened. But up in the northern part of the country, up in Scotland, they just kept fighting with each other. Basically, there were small kingdoms up there and on into the 12th century. And now we're getting into the time frame when there are records. There begin to be records. There's written records, not necessarily sufficient to do genealogies as such, but there are records of the kings and the royalty and some of the other people. And there begin to be some records of land. Now, how this all ended was that Ethelstan, the King of England, made an alliance with the three kings of Scotland and those different parts of Scotland there. So there were three kings there. And this was the Battle of Brunanburh, which is, and I'm sure I'm not saying that in a Scottish way. If I had a Scottish accent, I could probably do that really well, but I don't. But it happened in 937. And that was the turning point, because from that point on, England really had control over the entire that entire part of the island of the that was there. And basically, this picture that we just showed is called the Walton Spire in Nelson, Lancashire, and it was erected on the ground where that battle was that created the ascendancy of the King of England as being the person who ruled that part of the British Isles. And so they created a treaty among these people called the Treaty of Falaise. And the Treaty of Falaise was an agreement made in 1174 between William the First, King of Scots, and Henry the Second, King of England. What happened here is that William had the misfortune of attacking England and then losing and getting captured. And they got him captured, and they said, "Well, we have two things. You can become, you can swear fealty to Henry, the King of England, or it will kill you. You got a choice. Okay, what's your choice today?" So he uh, with using a little bit of initiative there, decided that he would rather live and would rather live as a English subject than as a dead English subject. So he agreed um, to the thing. From that point on, 1174, then we have England ruling Scotland. So Scotland then becomes, in essence, a part of England. Not now, if you say that to the Scotch separatists, the people today who are voting to get Scotland out of England, out of the what's called the United Kingdom, then you would find out that's a little more complicated than that. But from our standpoint as genealogists, we look at it and we say, okay, 1174, that means we're going to have some of the records start shifting down to England instead of from Scotland, and that's probably what happens. So he had to swear to be a subordinate to the English crown forever, and then they kept fighting. That didn't end the fighting, it just ended who had the succession of the kings and who was in charge and who owed what to who. So up into the 18th century, into the 1700s, we still had a lot of fighting going on in Scotland. Um, the answer to this is that when you're doing genealogy and you realize that the country, even up into the 1700s, was not necessarily settled in the sense that people were still burning either the castles down and killing each other off. That this indicates that there's going to be a lot of gaps in records and a lot of difficulty in doing research back into those time periods. So this kind of gets into the point where we have to see when all this coalesce into a something that would give us some basis for records. Well, what happened in the early 1700s is that they had what was called the Acts of Union. So even though England had technically the King of England was also the King of Scotland, or owned this was ownership of the ruler party, because they'd been fighting all that time. There wasn't any real definite point. So they came to a point where they created what was called the Acts of Union, and they took 2 years to do it, 1706 and 1707. And this joined England and Scotland as a united country, and which they now began calling the United Kingdom. So this is the date of the United Kingdom. Now, what does this mean for a genealogist? Let me kind of give you a really simple thing. If you are going back in time with your English or Scottish genealogy, and you have a date and a place, and the place is some county or something in Scotland or England, and you go past the date, then basically the place that it occurs in the date back to 1706 or 1707 is United Kingdom. Okay, some people put in Great Britain. It's not Great Britain. Great Britain's the island. Although the two names are somewhat synonymous a little bit, they're used interchangeably a lot of times. But the reality is that the the real name of the country is the United Kingdom, because that's what it was from 1707 onward. Okay, so now we come up to another thing that happened. Going a little bit later into the 1700s, Because there was this act of union, one of the realities of both England and Scotland was that uh, they were still living mostly in what was called the feudal order under feudalism, where the king owned everything. He was then gave land ownership rights, limited rights to his people, his cronies, people who he trusted, and then those people to their people under them, and so forth on down to the ultimate ownership of the land. The king owned everything. Nobody owned anything. Private ownership was only beginning to be developed in the late Middle Ages and in mostly in the towns and away from the big manors. But we clearly in the 1700s into the 1800s had this manor system where the lord of the manor owned all the property and all the people on it, in a sense. And in this case, we had a very dramatic event that occurred between 1783 to 1881, and that was called the Highland Clearance. And all this, what this kind of innocuous term means, is that the landowners in Scotland, in the Highlands, which were up in the hills, decided that they were going to raise sheep, which was more profitable than having small tenant farmers who were raising any number of different crops, mostly uh, the kinds of things that you would raise in that kind of climate. Well, what they did was simple. They just simply foreclosed on all of these people and moved them off and replaced them with sheep herders. And so between 1783 to 1881, these people were moved off the land. Now, what happened to these people? Simple. They starved to death. Basically, it was a very a basic economic thing that occurred. But understanding this is extremely important for genealogical purposes. Why? Because a lot of the people who came to America decided it was time to go to America. We have things like the Irish potato famine, where a lot of people left Ireland because they were starving to death. Well, now we have people, the same reason here in Scotland, they kicked them off the land and they came to America. Now, there was a difference here. And the number of people that were ejected from their traditional lands were about 170,000 plus people. So you can imagine how many refugees there were streaming off into the coastal areas and the larger towns trying to keep alive when they had lost their homes and their livelihoods and their farms and everything and all of their culture. Okay, so here's the Scottish clans. Now the clans, you can roughly use the word tribes. They like the word clans because that's the historical Scottish word for it. But in America, we'd call them tribes. But they were basically had a strong man, a chieftain, a person who was the big person, and all of him and his family and his descendants and anybody who was related to any degree would be part of this clan. And they were the ones who had perpetuated this almost endless series of fighting over the years. But they lived up in the mountains there. That was their stronghold up there. And when they started removing all of these people, it was, from some standpoints, the end of the clans, or at least that's the way it was viewed by the Scottish. Now, here's the bad part about it, and that is this. This is a famous painting by Thomas Fed, who painted this painting, and it's called the end of the end of the clans, or the thing. And the word clan comes from Gaelic children, and it's a kinship group. So all these people were related to each other. But what happened is when they got to the forced out and got to the, here you have a sort of a stylized representation of them being on the seashore. Well, when they really got to the point where there was a seashore, the only people that were allowed to immigrate were the young male people who were well. And so what you had left in Scotland were the old people, and that's what's pictured in this, and the women and children. So everyone else that had any abilities or any strength or anything was able to immigrate to America. The rest of them had to sit there and starve to death. It was a lovely thing. I mean, when you start, anybody who thinks that any one country has anything over any other country and what they've done that's horrible and terrible just has to go back a little bit in history. I mean, that's the way it works. So the Scots patronymics. Okay, well, what you need to know is one more thing. Let's just add this kind of a side note here is that uh, we have a type of name development that called patronymics. And what it means is, and it's most prominent, we think of it in terms of Scandinavian countries, where you have uh, Jens, a person named Jens, Jens, and he has a son whose name is Ovi, and so his son's name becomes Ovi Jens' son, and it's actually Sen or son. Well, either way, depending on the area. And if he had a daughter, it would be like Maria Jen's daughter. Okay, that would be their name. Now, Ovi, who was Jen's son, his son, who he named Thor, his son's name would be Thor's son. And so his or Jen's son, Ovi's son, except so Thor's name is Thor Ovi's son, and then his son would be Thorson, and so forth. Every generation, the name changes. Well, guess what? Every country in the world that we're aware of has a system of patronymics, and Scotland the word was Mac. So when you had MacDonald or MacGregor, that's the son of Donald or the son of Gregor. So that's the patronymic. In English, it's the same thing. We have Anderson, we have all those different names in English, Tom Johnson, and guess what? There's an interesting one. Jones, like Jones. Jones is John's son. It's a patronymic. And that's why, because John was the most common name, and now Jones is the most common name. So that's where that name came from. Those are all patronymic names. We can go after in any other country of the world. For example, Spain. Spain, we have a whole bunch of names like Rodriguez and Gonzalez and Gomez, and any name in Spanish that ends in es or ez is patronymic. And so that was adding that to the end said this is the son of. So Rodriguez is the son of Rodrigo. That's how it works. Okay, anyway, kind of an aside there, but this is what we are dealing with in the Scottish. Now, look at the time frame here, folks. We're talking about 1700s into the 1800s, and these people were being forced off their land and moved in, and either they were dying. So think about it from a genealogical standpoint. Let's say your great-grandfather, great-great-great-grandfather, whatever, came to America from Scotland, and he came over in the 1800s. And he shows up in America, and he's got no wife, and he's got no children, and you're trying to trace him back to Scotland, and you find out that he was from the Scottish Highlands, and his whole family was over there, and they all died because they starved to death. Okay, so this is what you're going to find this because you're not that far back in time. So unless you happen to know about this kind of problem that's occurring in the country, and this is just one example of the many problems, then you're really going to have a difficult time doing some research because you won't realize what you're kind of up against in a sense. So the Scottish immigrants to America began in the earliest colonial days. I mean, there's always people who were unhappy with where they were and decided to take advantage of the great opportunities in the New World, either to get away from being arrested or to get away because they were being persecuted or to get away because they just wanted to get away or whatever. And that began in the earliest colonial days. So if you go back into right after the first European immigrants came to America in the early 1600s, from mainly that part, Spanish immigrants were there earlier. Um, and of course, there were others who came from Europe, but the primary big push came from Great Britain initially, and then along the eastern seaboard, and then some of the other countries began later in time. But you always got a few Scottish immigrants, but then in the 1690s, there was another big problem there. There were failed harvests in Europe and particularly in Scotland. Um, if you ever get a chance, look at a globe and you look at the latitude lines, the runs that run around like the equator, around and up, and it tells you how far you are from the equator. Well, if you go and look on a globe and you follow that line across from Scotland over across to North America, you'll find out something really interesting. You find out that Scotland's way up there in Canada, as far north as a lot of places in Canada. And we always think in the United States that Canada's way up there north and it's cold and you know, but that's what Scotland is. Scotland's up there, and there's the climate there is the way it is because of what we call the Gulf Stream, which is this big warm stream of water that comes up and curves by Greenland, why it was called Greenland, and then down and hits England. If anything ever happens to the Gulf Stream, Scotland turns into a tundra. So it's a very interesting uh, situation there. Okay, so 1690s they failed harvest, which was probably something that happened inevitably. Again in 1717, um, they passed what was called the Transportation Act in Scotland, and they put all the bad guys, all their people who were undesirables. By the way, their undesirables included anybody who didn't agree with them. You didn't have to be a strictly criminal, like shoot people or rob things. You basically, if you were uh, a rabble rouser, or you were somebody who didn't happen to keep the same religious bent as the people around you, you could be convicted under the Transportation Act and put on a boat and shipped to America. One of the things that's interesting is we often think, if you're being in genealogy or history or whatever, you think about Australia and you think, oh, well, look, the Australians, they were all these criminals they sent from England to Australia. Well, that was under the Transportation Act. Okay, but what we conveniently forget and conveniently over kind of gloss over in America is that a fairly large percentage of the American immigrants, who we call our wonderful immigrants who came to America for freedom and religious freedom and all that, were actually put on boats and shipped over here as either indentured servants who were the best way to describe an indentured servant is to say a slave for a period of years. They were basically a slave for 7 years on the average. And then the other was people who were just transported. And we have a significantly large percentage of the American immigrants who were either indentured servants or transported to America. Now, what does this mean for genealogists? What it means is we get back to these people in the early 1700s and they just sort of appear in America and we cannot find who they are or where they came from. And even back into the 1600s. And why we can't find them is because we don't know who they are. There's no record of them coming across, and we don't have. And when they get to America, they found out there was something very interesting about America that was different than being in England. In England, if you ran away, in a sense, if you were on a manor and you were a servant on a manor or a tenant farmer, and you decided you didn't like being a tenant farmer on the manor and you picked up and you left and went to the next town, you'd get arrested because you didn't belong there. And there was no mobility. They just simply could not move. And later on, during the Industrial Revolution after the 1800s, that changed. But back during this time period, that did not change. But when they came to America, they found out that nobody really cared. And it was such a big country that you could pick up and change your name and walk across the street literally and disappear. And so in America, you have an inordinately large number of people who appear in America and who we know just by historical reasons, change their names, and that's how they got here. So basically what I'm telling you is there are dead ends out in genealogy. You may not be able to figure out who this guy is, but we're going to talk about some records, of course. In 1762, uh, that's where we had, this is where it fits in, where we had the Highland clearance. So there was even more immigration in 1762. And then there was continued immigration from the Scotch Irish in Ireland. Okay, how it happened there. The British decided to take over Ireland, and they did. And for many years, until actually the 1900s, it was part of Great Britain, part of the United Kingdom. And then the southern part of Ireland got their independence. Well, during that time, beginning in the 1600s, the English manors, the people, the manor lords of the aristocracy, decided that they wanted to get rid of the Irish. So they moved in. They actually recruited Scottish settlers, farmers, to move to Ireland, and they just simply kicked the Irish off their property and put in the Scottish. So the Scottish became tenant farmers, and then they had the potato famine, and then they all left. And this gets kind of complicated. In other words, we had a lot of reasons, economic and political things that were done in the British Isles to give a great incentive to people to move to America. And if we know about this, then it helps us to understand why and how and what kinds of records we may want to need to look at in order to find our ancestor if we determine that they came during one of these time periods. Okay, so what are the earliest records we have, the earliest written records that we have in Scotland? If we were to look at the Scottish records, what we can do. Okay, the earliest parish record is of Christian Hay, who was baptized on the 27th of December in 1553. This is the earliest record that we know of. We actually know the person, we actually know the date, and that's it. So 1553, and you are basically at the end of your parish registers in Scotland. Now that's a little bit later than it is in England. In England, the magic date is 1538, but in Scotland it's 1553. And what do you have to know about that? Well, you know that if you're going back in time and you get back into the 1600s, that there's a very high possibility that you're going to run out of records. And so knowing these limits of the earliest records in any given parish or any given area of the country is extremely important from the standpoint of determining when you're actually through looking. Civil registration records, meaning as opposed to church baptismal records and other records from the church, began in 1855. This is with the United Kingdom, by the way. So this is the same date for England and Scotland. So you've got the same two groups together under the United Kingdom. And so at this point, you have the same census records and you have the same civil registration records and things between English and Scotland. The dates are the same. And so we can look at records like Scotland births and baptisms, and they go back as far, and the record. So here's a record that's a collection of records that we call Scotland birth and baptisms. They go back from 1564 up to about 1950, and usually after that date, depending on the country and the laws that exist, we're talking about privacy issues and all sorts of other issues, including the fact that the government wants to charge for the information and for the certificates of baptism and everything else. So that's where you get, or the church, and so that's where that kind of ends. So where are all these records? Where are the records that are being kept? Well, first of all, we have a program called Scotland's People. This is actually run by the government, and they have subcontracted this out to various organizations. Most recently, it was run by findmypast.com. Find My Past had the contract with the Scottish government to run Scotland's People, but the Scottish government decided to take it over and run it again themselves. Now, what's the good news? Well, the good news is it's kind of a free website. When I say it's kind of a free website, that means that you can go in there and search and find your ancestors on Scotland's people. They have all the records, as many records as it's possible to think about doing. And then, if you want a copy of the record, however, you've got to pay for it. And we're not talking about, 50 cents a page or something like that. We're talking $5 or $6 or $8 for each record that you want to order. So if you want the original record and the copy, and if you want a certified copy, then you're going to pay even more. But these basically you're paying for records on a pay-per-view kind of thing, um, and you can buy so many credits and use the credits towards obtaining records. So it is a very extensive and very useful website. It's also rather expensive to use. Especially if you're bad at guessing who your ancestor is, and when you order the record, you find out you've got the wrong person. So you need to be really kind of careful at that. Now, fortunately, we have lots of other records out there. Find My Past has also got a lot of records from Scotland, and it's also a subscription website, and it happens to be a Family Search Partner website, so those members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, or LDS Church, have a partnership access to this website. But other than that, this is another source of records from Scotland, and it's one of the big records from Scotland. And then we have Family Search, and Family Search has been digitizing records for years. Since 1938, has been microfilming records since 1938 and digitizing records for years. And there are a lot of records from Scotland on Family Search. And then we have MyHeritage, another website that is out there with large amounts of information, and another place to find records for Scotland, and Ancestry, which has major collections in Great Britain and in all of the British Isles. So we have kind of the big five of the websites that can be used as a basis for finding all of these various records that are out there. So here's an idea. This is a kind of a picture of the startup page for Scotland's People. It's scotlandspeople.gov.uk, and it's a kind of a pay-per-view kind of website, with different grades of purchasing that you can purchase to get into the website. So it's there, it's available, and it's searchable. Okay, now we're going to talk a little bit about the specifics of these particular records that are out there that could be helpful in finding your ancestors. And understanding that the time limits here are sort of absolutes. When we say civil registration started in 1855, on January 1st, 1855, we mean January 1st, 1855. On December 31st, 1854, there was no record. And then they started the records in 55. Now, did they start them uniformly throughout the whole country? The answer is no. It took some time for the whole thing to get going and implemented and starting. And so you get different time periods depending on the part of the country that you're in. So you may or may not find a civil registration. What are we talking about? Civil registration, we're talking about births, marriages, and deaths. All of those things are being recorded. The difference here is the church record, for example, a parish register would be for a christening, not necessarily for a birth. That would be when they were baptized, when the baby was baptized, not when the baby was born. This is a civil birth registration, so they're getting birth registration. Now, why did they start these in the 1850s? Well, sort of the same reason they began doing civil registration in the United States, recording births, deaths, and marriages. Marriages go back a long way, and the main reason for that, marriage records probably are the most, the oldest records, some of the oldest records we'll find. And that's because marriage affects property ownership. And so when we ever have a change in property ownership is when we record marriages. And death records also affect property ownership. What doesn't affect property ownership is a birth. And so when people had babies, unless they were baptized in the church, there was no mechanism for recording them. Now, as industrialization began in the 1830s in England and elsewhere, then it was important to keep track of people and also to know what your basically the people who could come to work, what your worker group was, who can identify how many people you have. And so they began the process of keeping census records. And along with the census records, it was important for military purposes to have some kind of registration system. And so they began civil registration. Now we've in the United States we've opposed that over the years. We agree everybody should have a driver's license or identification card, but we haven't involved our federal government, the United States government, in civil registration as they have in England and Scotland and Wales and Ireland and most of the other countries of the world. There are very few other countries where they do not have a civil registration requirement. So basically in England and in Scotland, but in Scotland to focus on that, there are two kinds of when they talk about, there's counties first of all, which are civil political subdivisions, and then the counties are broken down into parishes, and the parishes are of two types. We have civil parishes, which are the governmental parishes, and then we have ecumenical parishes or parishes that are created by the church. So we have records, civil registration records are collected by a county basis and on parishes which are civil parishes and which do not always absolutely agree with the church parishes. So we need to be aware that there may be some differences there between the civil parish and the church parish. And that gets confusing because they both use the same word for parish. Now, the Scotland's people.gov.uk went online in 2002, so that has the civil registration records there, and you may also find them on any of those other of the 5 websites, including Scotland's People that I mentioned a moment ago. Okay, now let's talk about the census records. Census records were done for population, tax, and representation purposes. The earliest census record that we have for the British Isles is what's called the Domesday Book, and it was ordered by William the Conqueror a few years after he arrived and conquered England to determine who owed him taxes. And that's why they called it the Doomsday, because it was a tax thing. But anyway, it's not, well, that's what everybody says. But this is the reason for creating the censuses. And the census actually began in England, Scotland, and the United Kingdom in 1801. But there was just statistical information. It was like tick marks on a page, not names. So most of those from 1801 to 1831 don't survive. So they're not really very much of a help anyway. Beginning in 1841 and every 10 years thereafter, they began accumulating census records on a national level. And there you have the census records that are extremely valuable, by the way. One of my favorite things in England is because they give all sorts of specific information. When they give occupation, it really means your occupation. It's not just farmer. We get tired of that, but or laborer or whatever. But they do have that. But they do get into more specifics. Plus the fact they usually give exactly the place where the person was born, not some vague thing like Germany or Denmark or whatever. Like in the U.S. Census, they say the little town or the parish that they came from. So it gets to be very helpful records beginning in 1841, 1851, 61, 71, 81, so forth, all the way up until they have. And they're released every 100 years. Okay, in the United States it's 70 years. So we get the most recent census that we've seen is the 1940 census. And obviously we have quite a large number of people who are still alive who are in the 1940 census. Well, in England and Scotland, in the United Kingdom, it's every 100 years, so we just don't really have too many people that have lived to be alive when their census is released. So the last census that's now available is 1911. That's the most recent one, and it'll be 2021 before the next census is actually. It actually takes them a couple of years to get the census out after that. And provide the names, ages, relationships, occupations, and residence. Very helpful. Very helpful to do research in the 1800s, beginning in around 1841, with anybody who lived from 1841 forward, because the censuses are very thorough and contain sufficient information to tell the difference between two people with the same name. So it's been very helpful. Church and cemetery records began in 1552. The General Provincial Council of Scotland ordered Scotland parishes to keep the registers of baptisms and marriages, and the earliest registers commenced from 1553. This is a magic date for genealogists, because this is where you run out of records of the common people. You're just simply going to have a harder time, much harder time. Now, what everybody argues with me, and they say, well, yeah, but there were probate records go way back. Well, yeah, none of these people that were my ancestors had anything to probate. They had no property. They were tenant farmers. When they died, that was the last of it. They had no property at all. And it's certainly not enough to go through a probate in the court. So if you are lucky enough to have some ancestors that had enough property interest to get a probate, you may be able to go back a little bit further. And in the 1560s, the Catholic Church was abolished, and Presbyterianism grew in strength. Okay, so there, we recall, of course, that Henry VIII, had a disagreement with Rome over marriage and over getting a divorce, and he broke away from the Roman Catholic Church and created the Church of England. Well, that was the Church of England, not the Church of Scotland. And so they had the Catholic Church until the 1560s, and then finally, they had Protestants religion up there very heavily, and the Presbyterianism grew in strength. That does not mean that there were no other religious sects, but primarily the records passed into the Presbyterian Church. And in 1564, is the time for the earliest what are called blotter registers. Okay, that's a term you may or may not have ever heard of previously. A blotter register was this: the priest would perform the baptism, marriages, whatever, the last rites, death, burials, and he would write it down on a sheet of paper. So they would create a sheet of paper that was like a notepad. And then, because they were supposed to do this in a specific form and format, they would copy that into the formal parish register, so everything looked nice and it was all neat in place. So these blotter registers are out there, and they are secondary copies of the registers. Now, what happened if the priest just forgot to copy the name or copied it improperly? That's why these blotter registers exist, because they give you additional information that may have been lost in the transcribing of those records into the permanent parish registers. So that's what they're called. They're called blotter registers. And in 1600, there was a calendar change, and now the year began in January 1st. I'm not going to go through the whole deal of how all these calendar changes occurred, but this is for Scotland, that the calendar changed in 1600. So anything before that date, you're going to have to adjust for the difference in the days and the months of the calendar, and you have to look that up. Like I said, in fact, I think I ought to do one on calendar changes altogether, but I haven't put that on the list. That's a good thing to put on the list. So in 1603, James the Sixth of Scotland, Queen Mary's son, became James I of England. So we kind of had a turnaround here. by 1600s, uh, we are actually having Scottish kings in England, and that's what happens with royalty. You never know who's going to win out in the long run. And so James the First, the King James of England, is Scottish king. And in 1606, the government was established in Scotland. So he basically regulated everything between England and Scotland. So you had one king, uh, sort of like the one ring to rule them all, but it was a king that ruled everybody in the United Kingdom between England and Scotland. Of course, the United Kingdom didn't exist yet, but they did have one king. The United Kingdom didn't start until 1707, but back then there's still a unified government back in the early 1600s. Okay, so they began in 1616, 1636, and again in 1699, passing requirements that the Presbyterian ministers begin to keep registers. So you can see that even though there are old records, like I mentioned, the oldest parish register record, they weren't really compelled to do that until a series of laws were passed in the 1600s. Now, this is considerably later than the same series of laws that were passed in England beginning in 1538. So there's a little bit of a gap. More doesn't go back quite as far consistently in Scotland as it does in England. In 1690, the Church of Scotland, which is now a Presbyterian church, was established permanently. So from that point forward, if you're looking for church records in Scotland, you're basically looking for Presbyterian records. Now, how does that work with the United States? Well, or America, if someone left Scotland and came to America after 1690, chances are their records were in the Church of Scotland, meaning they're Presbyterians. When they got to America, they were not Quakers or Congregationalists. They were not Baptists. They were not any of these others. They were Presbyterians. And so the Presbyterian churches are the uh, religious descendants of the Scottish immigrants. They're the churches that came over with the Scottish immigrants. And if your ancestors were Presbyterians, it's a very, very good indication that they were Scottish, because that's where that church came from. So the church and cemetery records, for example, they passed what was called the Lord Hardwicke Act, and began to record many of the marriages in established church parishes from 1754. Understanding the reason we're going through this is once again to emphasize the point that if you don't understand these time limits, you're basically going to be out there wondering why you can't find anything, and the answer is you can't find anything because there were no records. These are kind of the end lines of certain types of records. And between 1733 and 1843, there were a lot of people that broke off, and the word here is nonconformists or successionists. Well, successionists are different than nonconformists. The nonconformists were people who joined other churches, the Baptists and all of these other break-off churches. My great back number of generations, actually fifth great-grandfather, was a Seventh-day Baptist, and they were called Sabbatarians. And so these are the types of people who were considered to be nonconformists and usually persecuted and sometimes sent to America or escaped to America to get out of being persecuted. And the successionists were different. They said, we're still Presbyterians, but we're dissenting from the dissenters were other denominations. So you had nonconformist records and you have other records. So if your ancestors converted to one of the other churches, went to the Church of England, or went to the Baptists, or went back to being Catholics or whatever, then these people would have separate sets of records beginning at different time periods. From 1783 to 93, there was a tax imposed on all entries in parish registers. So what do you think happened between 1783 and 1793? A lot of people did not go get their baptisms and their marriages and things done, and they didn't have any record of it because they had to pay something for it. So this is where you can see a gap in the records or difficulty. And you may also see they waited it out. So until there was no longer a tax, then they waited till there was no longer a tax. They took their kids in and got them baptized or whatever, or they got married or whatever. Okay, so this is kind of another kinds of things. And then you have what are called registers of neglected entries, and they kept 115 parishes kept registers from about 1810 to 1855, and there were records that hadn't been kept previously, so they were trying to catch up with who was a member of the Presbyterian Church and who wasn't. And then after 1855, you had what are called quad sacra parishes, um, and they were the ones that decided that they were going to start keeping records, and so they created new registers, and they also added in some delayed entries that had not been previously recorded. So there's a lot of reasons here in Scotland why records did not get reported at certain time periods. They weren't nearly as methodical as the English were, and certainly they're certainly better, however, in the number of records and the availability of the records and the consistency than Ireland, for example. But they are sort of more in between uh, England and Ireland, and not nearly as systematic and as consistent as one of the Scandinavian countries. So this kind of puts them. So a quad sacra parish is a parish of the Church of Scotland, which is not a civil parish. So it was a church parish. It had ecclesiastical functions, but no governmental functions. And they could, so you might have a number of these quad sacra parishes that could exist within a single civil parish. So you're going to remember they're going to be called parishes, and they're going to have different names, and they may cover the same geographic area to some extent. So you need to be careful that you're looking at what is the difference between a civil and an ecclesiastical or church parish. Now you have emigration and immigration records. Emigration means records of people leaving, and immigration records are those of people arriving in a country. You also have military records. Obviously, there was a lot of wars and battles and things going on, and from the time of the United Kingdom in 1707, by the way, Scottish military records are English military records. So you're going to be looking in the English archives, not in Scottish archives, because the army was Scottish army was English army, was the United Kingdom. So the militaries were united in 1707, and so there's not a separate Scottish military. It's the same as the English military. So the records are all in the same place and they're all there together. Now they had different units. Obviously they had Scottish units and English units and regional units, but the records themselves are the British Empire, United Kingdom records. Probate records and wills, they go a little bit back further, as I mentioned a moment ago, further than the parish registers, but they're more complex and they're definitely more restricted. They're the people that we're likely to run, that you and I are likely to run into, to a great extent, are not going to be people that show up in probate records. But it's possible that you happen to have rich ancestors. So my question is, why aren't you rich? No. Actually, and I know I'm going a little bit over, but I'm going to have to do that. Studies have shown that if you are directly related, descendants of the royalty in Europe, the chances are you're rich, and you know it. Okay, so these are the kinds of things. So if your parents haven't told you how rich you are and how royal you are all your life, then you're probably not, even if you do have some royal ancestors back there that you think you can trace to. Um, Royalty is very, very, very conservative and very, very protective. And so most of the people who are royalty know they are. and have been told that from youth, and they're rich. And we have in kind of a in America, in the United States, we have this kind of concept of the poor royalty, sort of the down on the down on the luck royal people who really don't have anything anymore, and they're all poor and they've left everything. Well, okay, but that isn't reality. Reality is most of the royalty today who truly descendant of royalty are the rich guys in Europe and other places. It's been shown. Okay, you can argue with me, obviously, if you want to. Maps and gazetteers all over the place. We're just tons of maps of England, Scotland. They've been doing maps since they could have had paper. Newspapers, there's huge stacks of these. The British Library, excuse me, has a huge newspaper collection that's being digitized now by Find My Past. British newspapers is a website, and they include Scotland. So the key here is to keep searching and keep looking, keep trying to find the records, learn more about the history, learn more about the records, start looking through the records, being more discriminatory, make sure you look for places and identify the exact places where your ancestors lived so that you can make sure that you're getting the right MacDonald or McGregor or McPherson or whatever, then when you get back into the records. And thanks for watching, and remind everyone that these webinars are recorded on the BYU Family History Library YouTube channel, and invite you to subscribe. Thanks.
Perfect. Thank you, James. Again, we have the polls down at the bottom of the screen if you guys want to participate in those before checking out today. And as a reminder, again, our next webinar is tomorrow at 3 p.m. Mountain Daylight Time, and it will be James Tanner again. So if you'd like to join us tomorrow, feel free to log on. And otherwise, they will be posted, like James said, on YouTube. Thanks again for joining us, everybody.